Happy Tuesday, everybody. Time to talk a little college football here. I'm Matt Josephs, Mid-Major Matt, filling in for Drew Martin this week. Big Ten West, the topic, and joining me on the panel, as always, Rob Veno. You can find him on Twitter at Rob Veno Sports, Ralph Michaels at Cal Sports LV.
Doing great. To start off the show, I tweeted something out today, Matt, and there's only one team that has won the Big Ten West 2 times with an undefeated record in the last 10 years. Can you guess who that is?
Well, since I follow you, I see the answer. I would have never guessed the answer. Why don't you tell everybody?
Again, it's Ohio State, of course, that was in the Big Ten West at the beginning of the decade, all the way to 2013. So certainly a trick question, but what a conference. From number 2 to 5, from number 2 to 6, those 5 teams in the conference, I only have them separated by 5 power rating points.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy when you look at it. Is it simple, Rob, as Wisconsin versus the field when we look at the Big Ten West overall?
Yeah, I don't know if it's that simple, but certainly I would make them the favorite. They get a little bit of a benefit this year, Matt, in the scheduling. And, Ralph, a couple of shows ago, when we started doing schedule breakdowns, mentioned the importance of crossover games. And for Wisconsin this year, the difference in their crossover games, at least using my preseason power ratings, is quite different. And it's a lot better and a lot more manageable for them. Last year, they have to play Michigan, Michigan State, and at Ohio State, which is a fairly tough schedule to be at Ohio State and home to Michigan. But this year they go to Indiana, which is, mid-rung in the East, at Michigan, which is the same as last year. But they get a break. They get home to Maryland, which is substantially less than what they had to play last year. So, they are a team that constantly reloads. We look at their offensive line this year, and I know that's where they've lost some talent. I think they only returned 2 starters, but Wisconsin, they breed offensive linemen, so we don't worry too much about that. Jack Cohn at quarterback. I don't want to say it's as simple as Wisconsin and everybody else, but right now they would be the odds-on favorite for sure.
So before we get into each individual team, one of the things I noticed when I was looking at this division, for the non-conference slate, there are just 2 games that will not be played in the home stadiums. You've got Wisconsin playing Notre Dame in Lambeau, and then you've got Purdue traveling to Boston College. Fellas, how much are you handicapping? We'll start with you, Ralph. We may not have fans in September, and that's when the majority of these games are. And in college football, home field matters a lot. There are some great home field atmospheres. So with all these non-conference games going on in September, potentially in front of no fans, how are you handicapping that?
Matt, I haven't yet, because there's a lot of energy you can waste with what ifs. But why waste energy now when we don't know what's going to happen? So basically it's this. I'm handicapping what I know: returning starters, revenge situations, close games, turnovers, and I'll let the schedule play out like it is. When we know what's going to happen, I'll then worry about it. But to give you a mini answer to that, when people say if there's 50% or less home field people where there are some fans but not capacity, I said I'll probably use 60% of my home field edges, and my home field edges in college football range from 1 to 6.5. So if I use 60% of those, I'll be looking for a half-point home edge to a 3 or a 3.5-point max.
Rob, are you looking at all, because you know that they have the games of the year lines every once in a while before we get into the actual season? Are you looking for anything to exploit potentially, depending upon if there are fans or not fans?
It's interesting to debate it, Matt, whether a huge difference. I will say this. Best for I found Australian rules football, and the stadium percent, and boy, they made a lot of noise for 20%, a lot of noise. So if Ohio State, which has announced a little bit early that they will fit 20,000 into the shoe, 20,000 could make a lot of noise if that's the way that works out. So as Ralph said, we'll wait and see if that's truth or fiction. But if it becomes truth, I think crowd noise could be a big deal. The one concern I have with totally empty stadiums, Matt, and I've voiced this before on the home favorites that get behind early, generally crowd noise and the crowd in general without that extra push to come back and, cover a point spread or whatever, or do road underdogs, ride the wave of an early fast start all the way through 4 quarters. That to me is a concept that I'll look into if it's empty stadiums.
Breaking down some of these individually, we'll go in win total order. I see a lot of 9.5s for Wisconsin. It feels like, guys, and we'll start with you, Ralph, the consistency Wisconsin has in this division and with regards to their wins is kind of like the Patriots, a lot, but the Badgers have won 10 games, at least in seasons. They've got 2 games in baseball stadiums. Ralph, what's your thoughts?
Well, I mean, you look at Wisconsin this year, and they have my number 14 strength of schedule. They're coming off a season, in which, you have a 2,000-yard rusher. It's tough to replace a 2,000-yard rusher. But I will say this. If you have to lose a superstar in any category, running back's probably the easiest to lose. They need their offensive line. You have Jack Cohen. How many quarterbacks throw 70%, 2,700 yards, an 18-5 ratio, and may get pushed in the spring by Graham Wirtz because they're so excited about him? So with a clear-cut team to go there, they did lose their 5 best players, 3 on offense, 2 on defense. When you lose a pair of guys like Braun and Orr that combined for 24 sacks, that's very difficult to pick up. But again, the other interesting point, we talked about the crossovers. Robbie talked about the crossover games. Let's remember, the Big Ten is a 9-conference game schedule. There's only one team in the West that plays 5 home games and 4 road games, and that's Wisconsin. So what a quirky schedule. Last year, obviously, it was different. Every team in the West played 5 home games with the exception of Wisconsin. They only played 4 in conference play. This year, big edge. Easiest schedule, only team in the West to play 5 home games. That's why they're the favorite to win the division again.
Yeah, and certainly, and you look, they've got that game in Lambeau against Notre Dame, and they've got that game in Wrigley against Northwestern. Rob, how does that account for when you look at the Wisconsin Badgers?
Well, the Notre Dame game being non-conference doesn't really mess with the big goal, which is to get to the Big Ten championship game, right? Your conference record is what counts. The Notre Dame, even if they were to lose that game, it wouldn't affect their chances to go to the Big Ten championship. I'm surprised that, Ralph, do you know if that was a Wisconsin scheduled home game or a Notre Dame home game? Who Lambeau? I would assume that it would have been a Wisconsin home game that they gave up to play in Lambeau, but I'm not sure how that worked out.
I don't know that. I think it was a game that was scheduled just to be neutral a long time ago, because when the Notre Dame signed that ACC schedule, they backed out of so many ACC game. I will mention this, and I'll get right back to you, Rob. When would you be playing Notre Dame in Lambeau Field, and it might be a trap game? You're coming off a game at Michigan, and you have the team on deck, Minnesota, that tied you for the Big Ten West last year. So how can you say Notre Dame and Lambeau Field's a trap? Looks like that for Wisconsin, where that won't be their focus.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true, Ralph. I had that sort of 3-game span circled here myself. Paul Christ, a pretty level coach. His team, generally speaking, doesn't show up flat. So it'll be interesting to see how they handle that particular situation. Again, Matt, I went over a little bit of Wisconsin before. I agree with Ralph that the scheduling, especially the crossover games, helped them this year to another Big Ten championship. The quarterback battle is certainly one that is concerned that Wisconsin hasn't had in a while. They haven't had 2 guys that can play like this in a while. The offensive line, I think, will be fine. And they just have, Jim Leonard's defense is Jim Leonard's defense. It's almost a plug-and-play system. So I don't think they'll be have any trouble on that side of the football. Until further notice, I think they are the favorite to win this side of the conference.
By the way, next year, these 2 teams, Notre Dame and Wisconsin, are going to play in Soldier Field. So clearly, I'm guessing that this is a series that they just decide to play in neutral field. 1 cent from each of you, 9-1 for Wisconsin to win this conference. Value or not?
I think there is, because they're the clear favorite to me with the crossover games and with the 5 home games. And then if you play Ohio State, I have them as if they play Ohio State, I'm looking at them being a 10-point favorite, so you can hedge the money line bet if you want at that point. So at 9-1, I think it's a fair bet.
Rob?
Yeah. As long as they get there, a one-game championship game, anything could happen. Who knows if Ohio State is injured by that time, and I'm assuming Ohio State would be the opponent. Ohio State has been able to handle Wisconsin rather easily in most instances in the last few years, so they have that going against them. But I would say, yes, 9-1, certainly some value, because you would expect them to be the team that faces Ohio State in that Big Ten championship.
All right, next up is Minnesota. 9 wins is what I've seen. 8 returning starters on offense for the Golden Gophers. A very nice, pillowy start to the season with 4 straight at home. We'll start with you, Rob. What's your outlook on Minnesota for the season?
All right, let's start here, guys, because we did a whole series of shows on coaching staff changes where the head coach, the OC, and the DC are all different. But there have been instances since we've started doing schedule breakdowns where one of those 3 is brand new. In the case of Minnesota, Kirk Ciarrocca moves on to Penn State. In comes Mike Sanford Jr. to run the offense for Minnesota. So the question becomes, will it change or will it not change? There's not going to be much change here with Minnesota. Mike Sanford Jr. was quoted as saying to come in and try to make them learn a bunch of new things would make absolutely no sense. But for us to try to find what's been done and grow on it makes a whole lot of sense. So you can see he's going to add a few elements. His philosophy is completely compatible with what Minnesota already does. So I don't really expect this offense to take a I don't think that last year was a one-off for Minnesota. If you follow PJ Fleck's teams get to a certain point, they maintain it. So I think Minnesota should be able to maintain. All that being said, guys, I was looking for a lot of ways to try and talk myself out of Minnesota this year in the West. And I based that upon the fact that when I went through the crossovers from last year, Minnesota played the absolute easiest crossover schedule of any of the teams from the West. And I thought maybe their season was a product of a softer schedule. They played at Rutgers, which was, like not playing anybody. They played Maryland. And the tough game was home to Penn State, where they came out and played very, very well. This year, though, the crossovers are not that tough again. Michigan State, which in my estimation, going through the coaching change that they're going through and having Mel Tucker come in as late as he did, they could be a mess from the get-go. I think it'll take them a while before they're correct. And then they play home to Michigan, which Minnesota absolutely could win. So the crossovers don't even bother me that much this season. On the defensive side of the football, Joe Rossi has done a great job. It's his second year, but he took over that defense, Minnesota's second year in the system. Boy, PJ Fleck built this team with his talent now, and I don't know that they slow down here, guys. The non-conference schedule, Florida Atlantic, Tennessee Tech, both at home, BYU also at home. All are games that are winnable for Minnesota. So for them to be in the race with Wisconsin, I think is a pretty sure thing right now. Like I say, I tried to talk myself off of it, but Rashad Bateman coming back at wide receiver, and to what I've read, they've got a couple of guys in line to take the spot of Tyler Johnson, and the running game is just fantastic, right? So I think Minnesota will be right there.
5 of the top 6 tacklers from last year are gone on defense. They also have a late bye, November 14th, just 2 games after the bye. What are you thinking, Ralph?
I'm a fan of PJ Fleck, and if you followed Fleck a couple years ago, he talked about how the team this year isn't his team, but the year after, which was last year's team. So he had it pointed to last year, and while they're still going to be talented, last year they had 15 and a half or 16 returning starters back. This year, you look at them and they only have 13, including 4 on defense. It's going to be an offensive-based run team that's going to need its defense to survive. All 5 starters are back on the O-line. 8 starts are all back. So it's going to be one of the strongest O-lines. Rob, you talked about the crossover schedules and how much easier it is. I have Iowa, which we're going to talk about next, the number 2 schedule in the country. Wisconsin, the number 14 schedule in the country, and Minnesota, number 47. So there's a huge drop-off at what Minnesota has to face. Minnesota's season is going to come down to this. Northwestern at home on the 21st of November, and at Nebraska 6 days later, the day after Thanksgiving on Friday. I see them down a step just for this reason. They made a historic rise. 10 wins for the Minnesota Gophers. First time since 1904 they won 10 games. They were +5 close games. In 7 games they won by a touchdown or less. That's tough to duplicate. When you're +5 close games on the season, I believe you're going to fall back. And then, let's not forget, Nebraska's greatly improved. Purdue's greatly improved. Northwestern is greatly improved. So when you had a run through people that were injured or banged up, you're not going to have that same run. And you may win some of those games, but it's going to be a much more physical season for them. So while I think they're in my mix in that 2 to 5 range, those close wins, the big jump up in wins, I expect them to fall back a bit.
We're starting real quick. I just want to, Matt, real quick. I didn't mean to cut you off, buddy. We've recently about the difference between handicapping and over-under wins and just game by game. Minnesota might be a team where you're kind of questioning, can I get through with an over on Minnesota's regular season wins? But I think, to your point in mind, both, when it comes to individual games and point spreads, Minnesota may not be winning these games the way they did them last year. And point spread wise, they may fall off a little bit. Last year, I have them as a 7-4-2 ATS team. A couple of pushes in there. They might not be that much over 500 this year. So on an individual game basis, maybe you want to be anti-Minnesota. If you're looking at season over win totals, I think both of us feel like they're it's a questionable deal with them right now.
Rob Veno, Ralph Michaels, I'm Matt Josephs here talking big ball coming up at the top of the hour. Tea time from Vegas with Jared Smith as they talk golf. 3 o'clock, some NFL talk with me, Ralph, and the Prez as we do some AFC North. And 4 o'clock is the KBO show with Andrew McKinnis and Dave Koken. Let's move on to Iowa, fellas. Win totals about 7 is what I'm seeing here. Some negative headlines. Hasn't been the best offseason. Hasn't been the best last week or so for Iowa as of late. Also, an intriguing non-conference slate. I know a lot of home games, but some pests potentially. We'll start out with you, Rob. What do you think about the Iowa here?
Yeah, these extenuating circumstances that are going on in the country overall for a couple of these teams, right, guys? I mean, Minnesota is not exempt from that. And, and no police at games. I mean, they have their own issues. PJ Fleck is a guy with his row the boat phrase, I think, keeps his team very cohesive, even during some turmoil in their home city. For Iowa, it was the strength coach who bit the bullet here and got fired. How much that means to the Iowa program and how well of a job Kirk Ferentz can do keeping his team together is another question that has to be answered. But for them in particular, when we're just going through their schedule, Ralph started this, and I'll pile on here. The crossover games, guys, they are difficult, and the 3 most difficult combined schedule for anybody in this division. Michigan State at home, and we know, like I said earlier, Michigan State under Mel Tucker might take a while to gel, but at Ohio State is as difficult as it gets, and then at Penn State is as difficult as it gets. So those 2 games, plus the Michigan State game, could find Iowa crossover-wise in a little bit of trouble here. As far as the talent goes, listen, Iowa, that bowl game was such a mirage last year. I mean, they come out and put up 45 or 49, whatever it was, on USC after having a season just full of close calls. At least nothing offensively that resembled that outburst, nothing point-wise that resembled that gap in, winning margin. So for Iowa, it's the same old thing all the time, right? It's a team that's going to live off of their run game and defense. They're going to mix in some pass. I think losing the quarterback here hurts. Certainly the tight end has been a big part of this team in seasons past. We'll see how that goes. They're just consistent, Ralph, and they just go about their business. But when we handicap them individual game-wise, boy, it's not a team that you ever want to lay a lot of points with because you don't expect to get much from their offense. Here's what I show real quick, guys, for the Iowa Hawkeyes. I show them as being favored by 12 at home against Michigan State, 15 at home against Northwestern, 12.5 at home against Nebraska, and then 7.5 on the road at Purdue. They could win all 4 of those games, but they could just as easily be 0-4 against the spread against all 4 of those teams, who we'll get to in a little bit, but all 4 should be improved this season. So for Iowa, again, tough team to bet as a favorite. I don't see that changing this season, and that crossover schedule is just brutal.
I'm curious to hear from Ralph and both you guys. That Northern Iowa game, I know it's an FCS game. Mm-hmm. Northern Iowa brings back 9 of their 11 top tacklers from last year. They allowed less than 20 points per game. Ralph, first off, I'd like to know what your line is projected for that game. And secondly, what are your thoughts on the Hawkeyes?
I'm still at 17.5, Matt, for the Northern Iowa game. But I will say this. All I did was look at the end of last year's FCS games. I have not looked at any FCS teams yet this year. So my FCS lines could be way off. But as you said, Northern Iowa looks like they're as good or even better than last year. Robbie and I are quite a bit off on our lines. The Purdue game, I have them as a 1-point favorite. I think Robbie has them as a 7. And the Nebraska game, I have them as a 5.8-point favorite. I think he has 12. So we're almost a touchdown off. You lost 5 NFL players. Alabama can lose 5 NFL players. Ohio State can lose 5. Michigan can lose 5. Iowa can't lose 5. You don't recruit like that. You were the number 35 recruiting program this year. You were number 41 last year. Last year, you only returned 10 starters. You did great going 9-3 in conference play, plus 27 yards per game. This year, you do have 12 returning starters. But again, you lost 5 NFL players last year, 9 NFL players in the last 2 years, including 3 first-round picks. You play the second toughest schedule. You have a midseason beatdown. When you have to go to Ohio State and Penn State back-to-back weeks, no question the toughest 2 games in all of college football on October 10th and 17th. Then you have to face Northwestern, who I have as one of the top teams in the conference this year, even though they only went 1-8 last year. And then you have to finish Nebraska, Purdue, Wisconsin. I just see them falling back. I'm not surprised at all if they finish 5th or 6th in this division. So, I'm looking, I did not bet the under. Their under is 7. So when I look at their schedule, I can see them getting to 7 wins. But again, 7 wins isn't going to put you anywhere in the top of the Big Ten West.
Yeah, and by the way, Iowa State will be a tricky game. It always is. The Northern Illinois game. We've seen NIU give Big Ten teams in the past a little trouble. So very interesting when it comes to Iowa. Let's move on. Another team that had a headline as of late, Nebraska. Total about 6.5. We saw that J.D. Spielman, the big-time wide receiver, is transferring from the school. Big year for Scott Frost. Ralph, what do you like or not like about the Cornhuskers this year?
Nebraska's a team, if we remember last year, my God, everyone was in love with Nebraska. Adrian Martinez had, more Heisman dollars than anyone in August, bet on them when Iowa opened their sports book. And, what happened? Well, they were a team last year that had 12 returning starters, had a number 17 recruiting class. And why did they go 3-6? Well, they lost their close games. Again, I expect them to bounce back from that. They were -2 in close wins. When you look at their conference yards per game, and again, I know you're new, Matt, to this show, but I'm big in conference yards per game when analyzing a team. You have Nebraska that was 3-6. But they were plus 20 yards per game. That is like a 5-4 team. You have Nebraska that was only outscored by 4.9 points per game. That is like a 4-5 or a 5-4 team. So they played much better than their record. They just didn't win their close games. They had so much pressure on Adrian Martinez and Scott Frost. Who knows what he's doing with his conservative offense as he's going to open it up. So, Nebraska, while, again, they're in the mix, they play the number 13th schedule, which is very tough. At Ohio State and Penn State and crossovers are 2 losses, which are going to concern you. But, they host Minnesota and they host Purdue, a team that I have Purdue, the first game of the year and the last game of the year. So I didn't get to the window at all with Nebraska because it's going to wait and see. But to me, I expect them to finish second or third in this division. And I'm almost going to think it's like the San Francisco 49ers from a couple years ago. Every 49ers, so much hype. It was just a year early. I think Martinez so much hype last year. I think it was just a year early. And this year, I think, is their year to bounce back.
I'll tell you this, Rob, as another guy who follows FCS football, I potentially will be looking at South Dakota State plus the points when they play Nebraska. 9 defensive starters back, an All-American wide receiver, some young quarterbacks who got a lot of time last year. What's your thoughts on Nebraska, Rob?
Yeah, that Missouri Valley Conference, Matt, that you've pointed out now twice with Northern Iowa and South Dakota State. I mean, for those who don't know, that's probably the best, or it is the best FCS conference in the land. So that conference runs, generally speaking, 5 or 6 deep with really, really good teams. And for FBS teams to take them on, and I don't see anybody taking on North Dakota State anymore, but to take on anybody from that particular conference, that's a tough situation. Those are not cakewalk games by any means with those teams. I think South Dakota State, they played somebody FBS last year. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head if it was Minnesota or not, but the South Dakota State gave somebody a real run for their money last year in a game. Ralph, I want to go back to what you were talking about as far as yardage is concerned, plus minus in total yardage, and Nebraska plus 20.2, one of only 4 teams in this division that was a plus last year. Minnesota plus 134.2, Wisconsin 85.7, Iowa plus 27, and Nebraska, of course, plus 20.2. The other 3 teams were all minus, negative total yardage last season. Nebraska brings in a new offensive coordinator, Matt Lubick. Matt Lubick is a guy that worked hand in hand with Scott Frost on the offensive staff at Oregon. So there's a lot of familiarity here. Let me just go through a couple of things that they're trying to do here. They're trying to make this offense more explosive, not necessarily one way or the other, although I think they're leaning to more pass because Lubbock is a pass oriented guy. Here's what they did this year, guys. Frost sent his offensive coaches to LSU and Oklahoma to study those 2 offenses, to bring some of those concepts back and implement them in Nebraska's offense this year. Whether or not they can execute, another story. Nebraska had 2 spring practices this year out of their allotted 15, so 2 is not a lot of on-field execution when you're working with some new stuff in the playbook. But I like what Lubbock had to say about this. They went and studied this. He said the challenge for us is you don't want to run 10 different offenses. That's a challenge of coaching. There's a lot of good offenses, a lot of good ideas, but they still have to fit within the framework of what you do. Nebraska, with only 2 practices, like I said, guys, it'll be tough, but I do expect to see more explosiveness. The Adrian Martinez deal, I mean, the fan base is so split on this. Should he be the quarterback? Should he not be the quarterback? He's actually underachieved, so to speak, since he's gotten to Nebraska. We'll see if Frost can pick this offense up this year. He's going to remain the play caller, which is another thing in Nebraska, guys, because they fired their OC, Troy Walters, and he didn't even call the plays. And I know there are some people that are a little irate that Frost sort of used Walters as a scapegoat. We'll see how that goes this year. Matt, you brought up J.D. Spielman. This is no ordinary guy. J.D. Spielman owns 4 Nebraska receiving records. There's been some great receivers at Nebraska, even though they were an option team for a lot of years. Irving Fryer comes to mind right away. But J.D. Spielman leaves. It was a mutual deal between he and the team. 33 games played, 170 receptions, 2,546 yards, 15 TDs. Like I say, owns 4 records. In Nebraska, I want to get behind him. But until I see what Lubick brings, I'm not sure. They have to start with Purdue right away. Ralph, I would say this, and I'm going to give you the floor. That game against Purdue to start the season, I'm very interested to see what the total is going to be, because I think even though there, trying to put some new stuff in against that Purdue defense. It would probably work. And I'll be looking maybe to play over in that first game against Purdue. We'll see where the total comes.
Robbie, I was just going to jump in. It was last year's opener. South Dakota State was leading Minnesota 21-20 in the fourth quarter. Minnesota had to score that fourth quarter touchdown and go for 2 to win the game. South Dakota State actually had a 367 to 308 yard edge on the Gophers.
Yeah, for an old man, the memory's still there.
Yeah, I had South Dakota State plus the points last year in that game, so that was quite the enjoyable one. All right, guys, we got about 15 minutes, and we got 3 teams to run through. We'll continue on with Northwestern, about 5.5 win total. My favorite stat, they were the least efficient passing team, averaging 9 yards per completion, 6 touchdown passes, 15 interceptions, and 4.5 yards per throw. I will throw it over to you, Robbie. What do you think about Northwestern?
Well, you're right, Matt. The quarterback play was an absolute disaster last year. The 4 guys that were involved. And let's face it, Hunter Johnson, a 5-star recruit coming over from Clemson to start the season. Northwestern never gets near a 5-star quarterback recruit, and you would have thought that he could perform inside that offense, but for whatever reason, he did not. Northwestern was an absolute mess offensively. Even though they were terrible offensively, Ralph, I think this bodes well for them. We were just talking about margin in total yardage, and for Northwestern, as bad as they were on offense, they were only minus 57.7 yards. That's not a lot of separation for a team that couldn't move the football whatsoever, 278 yards per game. The defense was tremendous. It's a Pat Fitzgerald staple. They have brought in Mike Bajakian to be their new offensive coordinator here. So we'll see what happens where that is concerned. They are not, as of yet, guys, committing to a offensive system. All right. They won't tell you exactly what they're going to play yet, but we'll go through. I think there's some pretty good hints here that it's going to be a spread system for Northwestern, because it looks to me like Indiana transfer quarterback Peyton Ramsey will win this job. Didn't have enough time in the spring to outright win it. It'll still be a competition when fall practices start. But to me, Peyton Ramsey looks like the guy, and what fits his strengths, we've seen him at Indiana, is a spread style offense. Bajakian and Fitzgerald sat down together and, spent a lot of time on this offensive playbook, putting in multiple different things so that they could, whatever they do pick in the end, whatever they choose at the end of fall practice, they'll be able to run with in the playbook. They want to build it around the QB strengths, which is another reason why I think it'll be multiple, because Ramsey's strengths are in a multiple offense. Contains a little bit of last season's offense, and they tweaked some stuff and added a lot of new stuff. Bajakian's body of work is pretty well-rounded, guys. He was the he ran Central Michigan's spread offense way back when Antonio Brown was the star wide receiver on that team. So he's pretty well-versed in a spread. He's also pretty well-versed in vertical downfield because he coached under Bruce Arians at Tampa Bay. And then last year, he was the OC in Boston College's, power run style. So you can see he's got a lot of backgrounds here. He can go to a lot of stuff. I think that diversity helps. The one thing he said, the one thing we can take to the bank here with this offense is that it's going to be high tempo. So expect Northwestern to play at pace during their practice sessions, of which I think they had 8. Ralph, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they had 8 practices. They ran every play offensively in 20 seconds or less. He wanted to get this team conditioned to getting up to the line of scrimmage, looking over the defense, reading it immediately, and he just figures repetition at that speed will breed success offensively. We'll see if it does, but I think Northwestern is, guys, I think they're primed for a comeback season here. The defense still looks pretty good, and if Ramsey can come in and run this offense, I think Northwestern's going to surprise a few. At least we're covering the point spread is concerned.
Rob, I enjoyed the unders in Northwestern games. Sounds like I may not be able to attack those again.
Yeah, I'm going to make this quick because I know we're running out of time. Absolute my best bet. Of every show we've done so far, Northwestern over 5.5. If you remember last year, Northwestern was 8-1 in the conference. They beat Wisconsin by 3 games in this division. What happened? They went 1-8, and everyone throws them in the trash. Well, that's going to happen when you have to start 16 quarterbacks. You now have 18 returning starters, the most in college football. You have 88% of your offense back. You have 80% of your defense back. That doesn't even count Ramsey, the quarterback, who had 7 starts at Indiana. That doesn't count Rain, the tight end from Florida Atlantic, who's going to pitch in. You have Pat Fitzgerald, who lost no one to the transfer guide. And you have the favorable schedule where you're gonna go to Michigan State, which I have them winning. You get to host Maryland, and your one crossover game is at Penn State. Over 5.5 wins, my absolute best bet, got to the window. I'm betting them to win the division, and I'm betting them to win the conference.
Wow, a lot of love for the Wildcats there. As Ralph said, we have just a couple minutes left, 2 teams to get to. So, Ralph, take it away on Illinois, 112th in the nation in total offense last year, but just over 26 points per game. So, what are you looking for them?
I have them down. I have them finishing 6th in the division. I'm going to make it simple. Illinois returns 14 starters. And while you think, wow, Illinois, got to 6 and 7, they got to a bowl game, they were outgained by 149 yards per game in Big Ten play. That's closer to Maryland and Rutgers than it is to anyone else. Why did they get to 6 and 7 and get to a bowl game? They were plus 10 turnovers in the Big Ten. In those 9 games, they were plus 10 turnovers. I think they had 7 defensive touchdowns. That's not going to happen again. They are going to be last in the division, and while they may be better, their record is clearly going to fall back because the fortuitous wins that they had last season.
Rob, 2 things. Lovie Smith has shaved his beard, so that has to go into the handicapping. And also, that Illinois State game is going to be interesting. Another Missouri Valley opponent who could be rather plucky.
Yeah, no doubt about it, Matt. For those listening, check out those FCS Missouri Valley teams because they are a difficult out, especially when they have a reason to play, which would be an FBS team. Obviously, it's like a little brother, big brother situation. For Illinois, Ralph, the total margin, the total yard margin gap is going to be a lot to overcome. Lovie Smith has turned into the transfer portal king. Illinois just is scooping up player after player after player through the transfer portal. Having to integrate them into your systems could be a little bit difficult. I'll say this. I think they're going to be improved. I think they're better. And Lovie Smith has them. They've learned how to play that Tampa 2 defense at Illinois a little bit better. As horrible as they were last year, guys, they were an 8-5 against the spread team. So they could be horrible again and still be a moneymaker as far as individual games are concerned, because I think the talent level is up. Obviously, Lovie Smith has gone, like I say, the route of the transfer portal. So look for Illinois to be a little bit better. Don't dismiss them as far as covering games is concerned, because they're probably still going to be lined. Generally speaking, they'll be lined getting as many points as they were last year, maybe a couple less, but the improvement in personnel could make up for that.
Illinois about 5 wins on the win totals. Final team also on 5 wins, Purdue. They did not get the memo to cream puff up their non-conference slate. Memphis, Air Force, and at Boston College, the only true road game in this division. I'll start with you, Robbie. What do you think of Purdue?
As adamant as Ralph just was with his best bet on Northwestern, I will say this. I think Purdue over the total is going to be a gold mine this year. I really do. Jeff Brom, first off, guys, really quick. For me, Jeff Brom might be the most honest head coach in the nation. He tells you exactly what he feels. He doesn't go through coach speak. And if you want to listen to him, you'll find out some things. This year, they bring in Bob Diaco to run their defense. They're going to shift from a 4-3 to a 3-4. We've talked about it numerous times on this show, what that entails, including position changes. You'll see 3-4. You'll see some 3-3-5. You'll see some 4-2-5. Diaco had some success at Louisiana Tech, helping their defense last season. But to convert Purdue right now into a 3-4, where their biggest position of depth shyness is linebacker, is tough. You're going to have some defensive ends that can pull back and play OLB. You're going to have some safeties that can move up and play linebacker to cover up for the depth shy problem that they have on the defensive side. I don't think they're going to stop anybody, but I do think they'll score. Rondale Moore lost a ton of season last year, and he's back. Maybe well, he is top 3 most exciting players in the Big Ten. You could probably argue in a bar room that he's number 1. But what they found in David Bell last year to go along with receiver is outstanding. I think this offense is going to be very, very good. Brom's an offensive guy to begin with. I don't think the defense is going to stop anybody. For me, over the total just sits as one of my best game day individual game bets this season.
Ralph, what's your thoughts?
Purdue's the team that I struggled with the most. Are they going to be improved? Absolutely. They went 3-6. They were minus 52 yards per game. Probably the one of the most important stats, if anyone that loaded the college football guide, you still can if you go to WagerTalk and go to my homepage. When you look in the middle column, when I break down the conferences, I have percent of starts made by class. Purdue last year, because of their injuries, had 32% of their starts. So a third of their starts by freshmen. That gets you prepared for the next year. Remember that they were a team that in their 4th game of the year at Minnesota lost Sindelar, and then Moore got hurt as well. And let's not forget the best defensive lineman was hurt for the season as well. He's expected to be back. I could see Purdue finishing 2nd in this conference. The problem is I have them as the number 12 strength of schedule. You look at their crossover games. At Michigan is tough. At Indiana is that throw up. But when I look at Minnesota, those 2 guys that I have grouped right with them, since they're on the road, the both of them, that's my concern that they can pull out those wins, and I don't think they can. So a team that I may be betting on quite a bit. I love those teams that are greatly improved, but it may not show up in the record because the other teams in the division are greatly improved. Those can be monster ATS teams. And Purdue, even though they went 8-4 against the spread last year, because of their 4-8 record, they're not a team that people are going to remember and automatically be a bet-on team this year. So I have them circled game by game, but I don't expect them to make a big jump up because of the rest of the competition in this incredibly tight Big West.
All right, one sentence each. Ralph, I'll start with you. Big Ten champion is?
Ohio State. But again, I am betting Northwestern as a flyer. But again, Big Ten, Wisconsin the favorite, plenty, incredible value with Northwestern. Also bet the flyer on Northwestern to beat Ohio State in the Big Ten championship.
Rob?
Yeah, Ohio State for conference champion, Matt. I don't think that it's even close. At least according to my power ratings, they're 14 better on a neutral field than anybody else in this particular conference. West, I agree with Ralph. I think Wisconsin should be there, but it is open for, those next 5 spots are all wide open. There's plenty of room for improvement out of all these teams. Staying healthy will be key. And I will say that for me in the West, my best bet of the entire division will come when games actually start. And it would be playing Purdue over the total. I just think they're going to be involved in some extremely high scoring games this year.
He's Rob Veno at Rob Veno Sports. Ralph Michaels at Cal Sports LV. Don't forget tea time coming up at 2. NFL preview with me, Ralph, and Prez at 3 o'clock on the AFC North, and the KBO show 4 o'clock. Andrew McKinnis and Dave Koch. And fellas, I want to thank you for allowing me to join the family.